So we're talking about radiation, safety, efficacy. What does it mean for you as a practitioner? What does it mean for your patients to x-ray them? Because if we are all doing, it seems like everyone's very interested in NUCA. So everyone's interested in NUCA. In order for us to do NUCA, we have to assess and then correct the misalignment of the atlas vertebrae, the atlas subluxation complex. And we can't do that without these specific x-rays. So early in practice, patients would ask questions like, how much radiation is this? What's this gonna mean for me? Like that sort of thing. And I would give the answer that I got when I was in school here, and it was like, well, if you were outside in the sun for a day, that's about the radiation that you'd get from the upper cervical series. Or if you took a cross-country flight, that would be equivalent to full spine x-rays or whatever. It's just kind of things that I'd heard and no one ever backed it up. Those were the people who were like pro x-ray. The people here who were anti-x-ray were like, it's gonna cause cancer tomorrow and you're toast. I didn't know which way to go and how to even comprehend it, but you kind of work your way through. Then a couple years into practice, is anyone familiar with what's happened in British Columbia, in Canada? No? So in 2019, in British Columbia, it became illegal for chiropractors to shoot x-rays the way that we shoot them, for structural x-rays. The only thing you could do is shoot x-rays for red flags. You could shoot x-rays for if they had like recurrent low back pain that lasted longer than 6 weeks, then you could potentially justify it. But doing what we do, we couldn't do it. And it's still that way in British Columbia, which is just bonkers. So this happened in 2019, and this is when I first got involved in a part of a group. We're writing a paper. We're going to hopefully submit it for a publication this weekend. It might be another week or two, but by the end of the year, we should be published. But this has been like a 4.5-year project and lots of research involved with it and that sort of stuff. But I originally got involved with it because of the British Columbia thing. And you're like, it kind of comes out of nowhere. You guys still have philosophy classes where you hear about chiropractors getting jailed and they stand for their rights and all that sort of stuff. And you're like, I can't believe that would actually happen. All of a sudden now it's like real time and it's happened. It was the college, I don't know exactly which one. I think there's only one chiropractic college in British Columbia, but I don't want to call them out if they weren't the ones that did it, but I'm pretty sure that they were, at least they had someone on the board that was instrumental in removing the right for the chiropractors to be able to shoot x-rays. So they removed the right to shoot the x-rays. It wasn't just for chiropractors, it was for dentists and it was for orthopedists who wanted to shoot x-rays to monitor. They said all of that is illegal. And it all came from, has anyone ever heard of the Choosing Wisely document? So there was this thing, and this started back in 2017, and basically there was 80 different special groups of professions that all came together. They had like representatives who were not chosen by the people of the profession. They were just people who said, all right, we'll be involved. The ACA took on our portion, the chiropractic portion, and they had Christine Gertz, who, do you guys know who that is? She used to be the head researcher. She was in charge. She was like the dean of research, maybe. That could be her official title at Palmer. Now, she's no longer here, but she was involved. There was a bunch of other research deans from other universities that were all involved, and they all went through the ICA to give direction to the Choosing Wisely document. And like I said, there's like 80 different professions, and they all just wanted to say what is good care and how do you do a good job and all this sort of stuff, and what's a good way to tell if your practitioner isn't doing a good job, that sort of stuff. They came up with 6 different kind of suggestions saying this is what you need to do, and a couple of them had to do with x-rays. You only shoot x-rays if you have red flag issues. You only shoot x-rays after 6 weeks of chronic low back pain that doesn't get any better. You never shoot structural x-rays. You only shoot for pathology. And if you do it differently than that, then you're essentially doing it wrong. Which if you were doing, if you were big into Mopal, right? Which nothing wrong with Mopal, but if you're big into Mopal, there's not a whole lot of benefit to shooting x-rays. You're not going to shoot structural x-rays. If you were a big diversified doc, you wouldn't need that. So from that standpoint, it kind of made sense. They were kind of concerned about chiropractors who were shooting x-rays and then just essentially being able to upcharge. And so they kind of wanted to put a stop to that, I guess. That seemed like that was at least part of it. But there was a whole nother part of it that seemed like it was a lot more sinister-ish, because they used a handful of different studies. So complete side note, right now you can't find the Choosing Wisely document. It does not exist. It is not on their website. The last time I was looking at it was maybe like 4 years ago, but it does not exist. You go on the ACA website, it doesn't exist there either. There's just some editorial remarks from Christine Gertz and a couple other docs on there about the document, but the most recent's like 2019. So there was a huge blowback because of it, and now all of a sudden it just vanished, but yet whatever that was continues on in British Columbia. So you're shooting x-rays and you're trying to figure out the structural changes, right? You're measuring the well, we can't say pre and post, we have to say intraprocedural, but you're measuring the change. But some of the studies that they used, like for instance, one of them was a study out of the UK, and there was 500 patients, all with low back pain, that presented to clinics. It was just completely randomized. Half of them got low lumbar films because they had low back pain. Half of them didn't get lumbar films because they had low back pain. And then they said, what were the outcomes? Were there any differences? And there was no difference in the outcome assessment. There was no difference in medication that was prescribed. There's no difference in surgical procedures. There's no difference in, orthopedics. This was a hospital setting. These were a bunch of medical clinics throughout the UK who shot x-rays, and then they said, well, as you can tell, lumbar films aren't that beneficial. And that was like the thing that they hung their hat on. And then they took a few other studies, and like one of them they were looking at, they said like 20-year-olds have a certain amount of degeneration in the spine, and 80-year-olds have a certain amount of degeneration in the spine. And there's just it doesn't make sense to shoot the x-rays and talk about the degeneration because it's just gonna exist, and otherwise you're just kind of like fear-mongering. And it's like, all right, that makes sense. I am fully on board with that. But don't pretend like you're using studies that pertain to our profession to then try and dictate how we're giving care. That came through the Choosing Wisely thing by the ACA, which I'm not trying to dog on the ACA, but they should be called out for this. So then that went through the British Columbia thing, and now you can't practice. So that was why I originally got involved, because I was like, I need to understand this, and also you have to do something, or at least I thought so, because if you don't do anything, if you don't do something, who is going to, sort of thing. So get involved and then try to make a difference. It's been like close to 5 years now in the process, and it'll be probably over 5 years before we finally get published. But because of all of that, now I got to do like a huge deep dive on this sort of stuff. So it's common, right? And maybe it's changed here at Palmer, but at least when I was here, x-rays were kind of frowned upon. And they kind of insinuated that you probably weren't a good doctor if you were in the field shooting x-rays. Well, this is a QR code to a study. It was a survey that was sent out a few years ago. There was 50,000 emails that it was sent to. 5,200 people opened it. Like 4,500 docs actually responded to the survey. Over 97% of the docs that responded to the survey said that x-rays are beneficial and they are meaningful to their practice. 97% agreement. That is insane. Like, what else can you get 97% agreement on? So feel free to take a picture of the QR code if you want to check out that study. So if you're like, I can't be that crazy, x-rays are beneficial, a lot of people agree with you. So there are, like I said, there's others that don't have the utility for them, and so they're not going to agree with you. But it's important to recognize, like, there's a lot of people that do similar things to what we do, and I mean, fortunately, we get really good results. So where does all of this come from? Anyone familiar with the LNT model for radiation? Linear non-threshold model? So it came about in I think it was 1959. The idea is that any amount of radiation, no matter how little, is cancer causing. So linear non-threshold. It's a straight line, and there's no threshold for good and bad. It's just all bad, no matter what. So the entire idea, you guys familiar with like ALARA? Yes, as low as reasonably acceptable. But the whole idea is that any amount of radiation is bad. The only problem is there isn't the evidence to back this up. The LNT model is a hypothesis in its most basic form. So the LNT model says that any amount of radiation is bad. There isn't any evidence for anything less than 100 millisieverts, and there really isn't any evidence between 100 and 200 millisieverts of radiation that there's anything bad with it. And the funny thing is, the regulatory bodies agree with this. So this is from American Association of Physicists in Medicine, nothing to do with chiropractic. At the present time, epidemiological evidence supporting increased cancer incidence or mortality below 100 millisieverts is inconclusive. So millisieverts is just a measure of radiation. How much radiation do we get when we shoot x-rays? Say if you shoot a full spine set of x-rays, anybody know? Any guesses? Depending on the technique you're using, depending on the x-ray, depending on all this stuff, it's about 1 to 1.5, 2 millisieverts at the absolute maximum if you're, not knowing at all what you're doing. Also, just living here in Davenport, Iowa, you have about 3 millisieverts of background radiation just living here in a year. So that's how much we're subjected to. Also, our bodies create radiation. It's measurable. Our bodies, our own bodies, have radiation. There's radiation in banana peels. There's literally radiation in everything. Maybe not everything, but we are constantly surrounded by radiation. Like I said, Davenport, about 3 millisieverts on average. Denver, about 15 millisieverts. That's a 5 times difference. 5 times difference, and there's not a single shred of any difference at all in cancer incidence, in mortality, nothing. Have you guys ever heard of Ramsar, Iran? Yeah, I bet you have. So I hadn't prior to this, but now I do. Ramsar, Iran is the most radiation-dense place on the planet. 270 millisieverts of radiation a year, just living in Ramsar, Iran. Guess what? No epidemiological study has ever been done, or I shouldn't say has been done, plenty have been tried. Nothing has ever proven that there's anything at all linking living here versus living here more cancer incidence. It's actually the contrary, which we'll get into later. But there are people who go to Ramsar and go to these like salt caves, and then they go for healing properties and healing benefits. So a lot of these different groups will say 100 millisieverts is the threshold. But remember, we're talking about the linear non-threshold, which that governs everything, is that there is no threshold. But most everybody agrees there's a threshold, which is interesting. But a lot of times people will say, there's no threshold even below 200. And obviously you can make the argument that it's up to 270 that there's no threshold. So, okay, so this John Boyce character is from Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. So he essentially just gives advice, tells people who make laws and rules and such, this is what this is what you should do. And he says the LNT model is an assumption. Now, I wasn't a huge stats nerd in school, but there's something about the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is that there is no difference, that there's no correlation between these two things. One thing's not causing, one thing's not correlating, there's nothing. That's the null hypothesis. The problem with the LNT model is that it is asserting that there is, it's basically, I think I got another quote in here from the next one. Yeah, so he's just saying that it's more plausible and that present scientific knowledge doesn't give another option as to what could possibly be the issue with radiation. So here, this is the Bayer 7 report. So this is biological effects of ionizing radiation, I think is the Bayer one. So basically, yeah, don't you love this? Computationally convenient starting point. The LNT model is convenient, so that's why we're going to use it, because it's been around since 1959, and obviously that makes sense that we should keep it around. And the funny thing is, these are the groups of people, and like you've got esteemed researchers, like all these people have won all these awards, and they do all this, they get all kinds of money, they do all this stuff, and that's their best argument. It's insane. And that is why, back to British Columbia, that's why it's against the law to shoot x-rays in British Columbia. So, and then the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, they're very involved in radiation. They also say LNT model is a default assumption, which is not scientific, because scientific would be a null assumption. There is no relationship. We have to establish a relationship. So this flies in the face of science. And like, I'm upset about it, but you should hear some of these like nuclear physicist nerds. They are fired up about it. So it doesn't make any sense, and that's the problem. So the other part of it is it's impossible to disprove a hypothesis that is saying that it exists when there isn't any evidence to disprove. So it just will go on in perpetuity because you can't disprove it if it doesn't prove it. Does that make sense? It's a weird statistics thing, or researcher thing, I guess. So instead, there's a different model. Anyone ever heard of hormesis? The hormetic model? Yeah? All right. So if you guys want a quick grand, just find a study in English, scientifically acceptable evidence to show any increased cancer death rate or decreased average lifespan. Anything. $1,000. Just like that. You know, you could, I don't know, buy yourself a nice TV and probably still have money left over. The hormesis model states, first, maybe I'll take a step back. So the shred of evidence that they stand on to say why radiation is bad is there is no doubt that when you irradiate a cell, it does damage the DNA of that cell. It damages it, it likely doesn't kill it, it just damages it. And there is no doubt that that happens. But it's about 3 to 30 alterations when you have this radiation. The body, though, has a natural alteration of 10 to the 10. That's a lot. So it's like 2.5 times lower than the spontaneous mutation rate due to normal metabolism. That's every day. So we're talking about the amount of radiation that the DNA is damaged by in a year is about 3 to 30, give or take, obviously. 2.5 times million less than what our body naturally does on its own. So you guys are familiar with like in vitro studies, right? Like they're in the test tubes and you can get this information and you can like try your best to figure out exactly that specific thing and what the cause is and all that sort of stuff. So the in vitro study shows that the irradiated cell has the damage to it, and that's essentially what they stand on. So these are like, this dude doesn't have anything to do with, you know, he doesn't care about X-ray, right? This dude discovers the oncogene, but he's just talking about the difference between like these double-strand helix breaks, which nobody can disagree that they exist, but he's saying how negligible is that? So the reason that it is negligible is because of the bystander effect. The bystander effect is why hormesis works, or potentially works, right? The irradiated cell, it's hit with the radiation. There's a cell next to it that is not hit with the radiation. So that cell acts as a buffer and it actually kind of kills that cell, right? So it stops whatever that cell is doing. There's lots of evidence for this. And that's why the hormesis effect is that essentially these kind of damaged cells are then cleaved off, so our body gets stronger. It's like it creates this resistance to it. And that's why we'll look at a couple more studies here, but it's very interesting when we see these low-level radiation, we see the person actually getting healthier. And that's not even my argument. I don't even care about that. I just want to be able to shoot the x-rays without having someone trying to take that away. Basically, the entire world has been on this LNT model since forever. Then in the 90s, Japan had 15 studies going on in 10 different universities. They started to look at hormesis. In early 2000s, I think it was like 2006, the French Academies of Science actually fully adopted hormesis. So they no longer abide by the LNT model. For them, it's hormesis. And so is China, and I believe Japan is fully on board now too. The nuclear physicists, there was a survey that was done, there was like 21% of nuclear physicists believe the LNT model makes sense. Like 79% are like, whoa, this doesn't make any sense. So it's like, it's not just us. There's plenty of people, and then there's unfortunately just people who are in charge that say, no, we don't really care what you say, you can't really prove it or whatever. So here's the hormesis model. He's talking about the protective effect, the bystander effect, with that nearly missed cell there. All right, so here's some kind of interesting, just pulled some tidbits from a few different studies. You guys have heard of Chernobyl, right? Like that's a reason why radiation is so dangerous. Total cancer deaths, 8,600 cleanup workers at Chernobyl. Now, don't get me wrong, the people who died in the explosion and then like that aftermath right there, of course, they had high levels of high LET radiation. What we do is low LET. basically what we do when we shoot x-rays, or if you do CBCT, it's low LET radiation. Like nuclear medicine or nuclear science, that's high LET radiation. So these cleanup workers who received an average of 5 CGY, so we've already talked about MSV, CGY is another way of measuring it. 5 CGY would be equal to 50 MSV. And we were talking about how there's no evidence for less than 100 MSV, 8,600 cleanup workers, 12% lower than that of the general Russian population. Total cancer deaths. So people talk about Chernobyl and that should scare you. No, it shouldn't. It should actually give you hope. You're like, wait a minute, like this makes sense. So this T.D. Luckey guy, if you want to learn more about radiation, check him out. There's 3,000 plus papers on hormesis right now, and this dude, he loves putting stuff out about it. It's really good. Okay, so here's another one. This is a very interesting one. So this is a study out of Taiwan. In 2004, they had like 10,000 people who lived in these 2 apartment complexes. They lived there for like, on average, I think it was like 9 years. They built these apartment complexes with cobalt-45, which is some type of steel structure that has like quite a bit of radiation, and nobody knew it when they built it, and then all of a sudden they found out. So these people lived in these apartment complexes for, I think it was 9 years on average. There's 10,000 people, so obviously there's quite a variation. But they had long-term exposure. So the experience of the 10,000 people, long-term exposure at a dose rate in the order of 50 millisieverts per year, they reduced by 95% cancer incidence rates compared to the general population. That's insane. That's crazy. So 50 millisieverts there, 50 millisieverts there. We were talking about, less than 100, but that's potentially a hormesis. That's potentially evidence for a hormesis model. The biggest thing with that John Boyce dude from the NCRP, the BEAR group, that, biological effects of ionizing radiation, the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, all of them who essentially give us the rules and we have to follow or whatever, they all say there's not a better model. They also say we can't actually prove that this works. There's no epidemiological information to say that this makes sense. These are epidemiological studies that show that hormesis actually might make sense. Which is why there's, like I said, there's a couple of countries, or maybe 3 countries, that actually now have adopted the hormesis model.